I think it was probably when I first heard the lyric, "I drink, therefore I dagon am," that I first began to question the fairly strong emotional connection many people seem to have to this show. Oh my god, hey! Welcome back to my theatre-themed YouTube channel. My name is Mickey Joe, and I am obsessed with all things theatre. I am a professional theatre critic here in the UK, and a stagey content creator here on social media. I go see shows, and I make video reviews about them here on YouTube. Today, we are going to be talking about the one-night-only concert production of Made in Dagenham, the musical, celebrating the show's 10-year anniversary. The show opened a decade ago at London's Adelphi Theatre in the West End and has had a great amateur dramatic life. It's been done by drama schools, but it hasn't really had a further professional life since that original production. That is until now, a one-night-only concert at the London Palladium, the historic and grand London Palladium, starring pop star Pixie Lott in the lead role, originally played by Gemma Arterton, alongside West End Phantom of the Opera and Les Mis alumnus Killian Donnelly, theatrical legend Bonnie Langford, and a very rich supporting cast. But with so many of these concert stagings of musicals taking place at the moment, what did this one offer? Was it well presented? And is there a reason that we haven't seen this show in 10 years? And ought it have a future life beyond this concert? All these questions and more will be answered in today's review. I'm going to be letting you know what I thought of the actual material, this concert production, and the performances. Stay tuned. And if you enjoyed today's review, make sure to subscribe to my theatre-themed YouTube channel for many more stagey reviews and lots more theatrical content coming very soon. Finally, if you got to see Made in Dagenham in concert at the London Palladium over the weekend, let us all know what you thought in the comments section down below. And if you're someone who got to see the original production back at the Adelphi Theatre, let us know what that was like. Also, if you've been in an amateur production, comment about that as well. But for now, let me tell you what I thought of Made in Dagenham in concert. So, this musical is based on the film of the same name, and it is about the actual historic strike that took place at Ford Dagenham, this big Ford factory in Essex in the UK. What do you mean it's not in Essex? Apparently it's in London. Excuse me. In response to an unfavourable pay grading evaluation in which all of the women who work there and sew together all of the car seat covers are deemed to be unskilled workers, the dispute segues into a strike as they demand equal pay for women. This has an impact not only on the factory and the town and each of their lives and their marriages, but also the country at large, because the government get involved, American representatives of the company get involved. It has a very far-reaching impact. And given how much a British audience loves this kind of a story, it's sort of surprising that the show's original run wasn't more successful, especially with a little bit of star power in the lead, with film star Gemma Arterton. But reviews back in 2014 were not particularly favourable. They did not speak highly of the show's score, nor especially of its slightly reductive book. Like many film-to-stage adaptations, they said that the characters were a little underdeveloped, and the show ultimately closed. But if you ask me, if Made in Dagenham had opened in the West End now, within the last few years, I think it would be a lot more successful, because we are seeing some arguably slightly lackluster musical adaptations of films doing quite well, simply because audiences are really hungry at the moment for something familiar and commercial. Is there an audience gender element at play here? Are husbands reluctant to go with their wives to go see a Made in Dagenham, but happier to go see a Mrs. Doubtfire? I don't know. The two shows arrived in the West End almost a decade apart, and audience tastes have very much changed. I do think Made in Dagenham would be more successful now. More on that later. For now, let me tell you what I think of the show's material. So in truth, this concert was not the first time I got to know some of these songs, because I was briefly part of an amateur production years back, and so the ensemble numbers especially I already had a certain familiarity with. And because this was a less staged concert, it was a little bit harder to get a strong sense of the narrative, but I will tell you what I thought of the material. Because the story is really great, and I think that is what grabs people, and that's what connects to people. It's empowering and it's uplifting, and you cannot help but root for these women, especially because the rampant misogyny around them is so clownishly ridiculous, almost too much so, but then I wasn't alive during that time, so I can't speak to what it was actually like. I think it's very possible that if you represent period accurate behaviour, it's going to seem buffoonish and ridiculous even when the Prime Minister is doing it. But the story is very strong. It's my opinion, not all of the material serves that as well as it could. I think the introduction is very well delivered. I like how this initial music is characterised. It sounds blokey, it sounds era appropriate, it sounds really British. The whole refrain of "Made in Dagenham, laid in Dagenham, shame we're underpaid in Dagenham" is a great lyric, is a great hook, is a great melody. It's also been in my head perhaps for the 10 years since the show first debuted in the West End. And I think everything about the way that it's introduced and these characters are introduced is very thorough, is very detailed. But as the thing starts to gain momentum in the narrative, it's sort of reduced to only the moments of consequence and only its turning points. And rather than really being able to sit in a moment and examine these characters and the impact of what's happening to all of them, we just get, oh, now this is happening. Oh, now this is happening. I'm changing directions and going over here. And without ever having personally passed my test, I would imagine that it doesn't make for a very satisfying drive if you are constantly finding yourself at a crossroads and we have no time to really cruise. As well as that, I think there are perhaps just too many characters, all of whom have value because you want to spend time with all of these women, and then there's this subplot with the managing director of the factory and his wife, and he doesn't really consider her capable, even though she's very intelligent, even though she's an academic. She comes to meet our heroine and protagonist Rita O'Grady, who sort of unwillingly becomes the ringleader and the advocate and the mouthpiece for the striking women, because the two of them are both equally unhappy about corporal punishment being utilised at the school their sons both attend. And you also have this political subplot at the same time, where we meet the Prime Minister and Barbara Castle, who is appointed to be in charge of all of the mess that this becomes. She's torn, in word at least, between wanting to advocate on behalf of these women and having a responsibility to the government and to the economy and to the Labour Party, because, you know, equal rights, international trade deals. I love Britain, it's great. And so there's just a lot. It's a lot of plot and it's a lot of characters to fit into this 2.5-hour book musical. It also toes a very fine line tonally of having these more ridiculous comic moments and having some outrageously stupid lyrics, which for the most part feel deliberate. There's a song that the arriving American tycoon, I guess you could call him, sings. It's called "This Is America," and it's this big middle finger to the UK, basically, which a British audience will always enjoy. That's not me being ironic, by the way. No, we actually love that. That always goes over very well. But while some of these are used to great effect, there are other occasions when serious songs like "Storm Clouds," a song that represents the growing tension in each of these women's lives and in the town and in the country, I guess. There's a lyric right in the middle of that about the Prime Minister imploring Ford not to move their business to Belgium, and the ensemble in response to that sing "'Cause Belgium's really with nothing but sincerity. And it gets a laugh, but at what cost is what I ask. I also think we could cut some of the slightly pointless company numbers that just give you the flavour of a large group of people being rowdy. Like, I like Made in Dagenham, I like Payday a little less, I like Viva Eastbourne even less. That song comes at an important part in the show, and it's really just a waste of a few minutes for the company to sing "We're all here and we're gonna get drunk." Although I've never been to Eastbourne, perhaps that's what it's like. I also need to talk to you about the letter, because for years I've heard that this is like the emotional heart of the show. This comes in the second act, and there's a timeline issue here. I'm going to have to spoil some details of the plot for you. If you don't want to know about this, if you haven't seen the film or the show, skip ahead. But as the second act begins, Rita is struggling to balance everything, to balance her responsibilities as the ringleader of this important and worthwhile cause with her responsibilities as a wife and as a mother. She has to go speak at a meeting, but it clashes with her son's school concert that he's singing at. Her husband isn't happy about any of this. That's compounded by the fact that he and all of the other men who are working at the factory have been laid off in response to the women's strike. And as the two of them as a couple are trying to juggle their newly busy lives and move their kids around, he lets her know that there are a couple of hours in the afternoon where they might have some free time as a couple. He lets her know this when she is visiting one of her co-workers at the hospital who has just been diagnosed with breast cancer, or at least we've just found out that she has breast cancer. And so he he's telling her this under the guise of, if you're not too long here, then we can go home and have a nice time together. She finds out during this visit that she has to go to Redbridge to go and stop one of the other striking workers from accepting paid marketing work from the company in an attempt to pierce their solidarity. He's really annoyed about this revelation, and when Rita gets back from doing this, seemingly that same night, because the passage of time is not clear here, he has taken the kids and left her to go and stay at his mother's and left her a letter. And so this is where we get the song The Letter, where he is imploring her to think of her family, all because she had to go and try and stop one of her co-workers from, you know, destroying the entire strike action everyone's working hard for and advocating for equal pay to what he is getting, because he was hoping that instead they could go home and have adult time together. And in this song, in these lyrics, he talks about the kids and he talks about himself, but the whole thing is undercut by the notion that, you know, he's had to clean the toilet and he didn't know how to do it, so he had to use fairy liquid, and he can't use the washing machine, and he's burning food because he's just utterly incapable of parenting his children and sustaining the home at a very basic level, while also not having to go to work because he's been laid off. Like, he doesn't talk about the financial strain. He doesn't talk about the impact to his employment. There are probably things he could invoke in this song, but instead he just talks about how hard it is cleaning and being a dad at the same time. Two things that up until now, apparently, he hasn't had to consider. And again, I know we're of the time, and I know that's kind of the whole point of the show, but it's framed as this really emotional moment, and her response to it is to feel sad and to feel like she's done the wrong thing. And her response to this ought to be outrage, because it's so pathetic. Meanwhile, more spoilers on the horizon. And again, the passage of time is what makes this confusing, because it feels as though she's perhaps been on strike for a week by the time that he makes the decision to leave her, and then less than another week later, Connie, who has just been diagnosed with breast cancer, dies mid-sentence. We get told this by a man who works at the factory who has spent the entire show deliberately and maliciously undermining the attempts of the women to gain any kind of traction in the workplace and with regards to pay, in spite of the fact that he now confesses he was always in love with Connie. And so we gain a little more insight into her life and learn about her death through the voice of a man who we've only seen being awful to her and being antithetical to her cause. Like, the material doesn't even afford Rita any capacity to grieve here, because we just focus on this man who loved her. Like, what? It's ironic that at the show's most emotional point, women don't have any kind of a voice, because they're either dead or politely listening to a man. I also think, and I am nearly done talking about this show, I promise, that the song Stand Up at the end comes on the back of a well-written speech, but offers something of a generic platitude. And right before we get that final song, and I'll remind you, most important moment of the show, she is about to go and deliver this speech, and we know because it's a musical that she's going to sing it, right? Like, that's obvious. So one of the worst things they can do to take away the impact of that is to have her sing an 11 o'clock number right beforehand. So she basically ends up singing two solos back to back, and the second one doesn't have as much of an impact. And that 11 o'clock number she sings before, I don't know that it adds enough to justify doing that. But I've said enough about Made in Dagenham, let's talk about this specific concert. Now, when there are more and more of these concerts happening, I naturally gravitate towards the ones that have a purpose, the ones that are reuniting some kind of an original cast or celebrating some kind of an anniversary. And true enough, this is a 10-year anniversary production. But I do think if this was to be produced in good faith and not to try and make as much money as possible and spend as little as possible in order to make as much money as possible, would it not have made more sense to do it at the Adelphi, where the show was originally performed? Every time I see one of these concerts at the Palladium, I am wondering if it's actually going to justify that space and fill that stage. They had a lot of cast members on stage, I appreciated that. The band, though they sounded great, was not really full enough to look like they belonged on the Palladium stage, honestly. And with a venue like this comes not only the possibility to sell a lot of tickets and make a lot of money, but also technical challenges, because the sound was a huge, huge issue. And these concerts are plagued with sound problems. Not all of them. Some of them very diligently do the work to make sure that that isn't a factor. I mean, when I was at the What's on Stage Awards, the sound comparatively was really good. But the issue I had here was with these stand microphones. I had issues with these microphones both dramaturgically and technically, because even when people were using them properly, and after they spent the entire show adjusting the heights of them, there was one accidental comedy moment where two characters of different heights walked to microphones and then adjusted them in the opposite ways. Even when they were being used well, the sound quality was not good. It was muddy, it lacked clarity, and so if you didn't already know the show's material, you couldn't hear these lyrics. We also had a large ensemble at the back who didn't even appear to be properly mic'd at all, like there were microphones on them, but they weren't picking up much. And there are also moments of the show where characters stand at microphones because they're making speeches. When we segue into Rita making this pivotal speech right at the end of the show, she walks on from one side of the stage and stands at a microphone to start talking, and you initially think, oh, she's making the speech, but she's not. She's just off stage by herself having a moment, but standing at a microphone is the way that they had to do everything in this show, because that's all they had, because they didn't have head mics. The children, two actors playing Rita's children, had head mics because they're short and because the microphones wouldn't go down that low. Begging the question, why not give all of the principals, or at the very least Pixie Lott, who was playing Rita, a head mic? That would have helped with the last number, because we get to stand up and we have this complete car crash moment on stage where she is singing this song, and as it gets higher she is backing away from the microphone a little bit more, and she's a pop singer. She knows what she's doing. She knows that this is so that we'll be able to hear her a little less. I don't know if she wasn't completely comfortable with the vocal. She's also turning and looking to the people around her, and the way this has been staged is with a few rows of seating all facing inwards to her, so she turns to look at them, upstaging herself and turning away from the microphone, so we no longer get the vocal. And it's this fast lyric section that we miss completely. We hear stand up, if you're with me, something, put your hand up. And then there's sections that are like, make a stand for everyone, then the battle will be won, that's the way to come on. All of that, we don't hear any of it. This isn't helped by the fact that usually the ensemble are also singing this, but we're not hearing the ones at the back, and the ones who are sat facing inwards, they're nowhere near microphones, so we're not going to hear them either. So it's not really fair on Pixie Lott that she's trying to carry the entire vocal for this ensemble number by herself, and we're left with the most important song in the show, this final speech, this call to action, and all we really hear is the band. It's this huge, awkward anticlimax. And I do not know how much tech time they had. I do not know what other issues they may have been facing. I do not feel that this was an appropriate venue. I do not think the choice of microphone stands was a good one. I think it was confusing from a narrative point of view, and it didn't work technically very well. Inherently as well, I think a lot of the problem of doing a concert staging of Made in Dagenham is we don't get the sense of the women standing up every time, and it happens multiple times, that someone yells, okay, put everything down, stop what you're doing. There's no difference because they weren't doing anything. They weren't at work, they weren't sewing, they weren't sat down at their tables. We didn't see that production line. We didn't get the sense of them standing up or standing on chairs or walking out. We got none of that, unfortunately. And disappointingly, there wasn't a lot really creatively about the staging of this show that really allowed the material to shine. It only really worked on the occasions that very talented performers found ways to connect to the material's humour and make it funny. That's when the show worked, but that would have worked independent of anyone telling them what to do, honestly. And ultimately, I didn't have an awful time because I had fairly low expectations going in, and I thought that was a little bit of a mess, but it was nice enough. I had a nice enough time because I didn't want a huge amount out of it. And then I got to thinking about the fans of this show and the people who had paid for tickets. Let's remember, I'm invited on a press ticket, so it doesn't take a lot for me to justify my evening. But the people who have paid good money to see this production, much of which couldn't be heard clearly, that didn't feel like an enormous amount of care had been put into bringing it to the stage. And I got to thinking thinking about how disappointed those people would have been. And it starts to feel increasingly with many of these concerts, not just with this one, not just with these producers, but with so many of these that I'm seeing recently, and not all of them, but many of them, it's a little bit contemptible how little seems to go into putting these things together before they arrive at charging an enormous ticket price for people to come and see them. At what point do you care about the material and care about your audiences and actually entertaining people? That's the first hurdle. That is the very bare minimum of what we have to do with these things. It cannot be about making money and, oh, let's do this show, there's an anniversary coming up, that's an excuse to do it, let's do that. There has to be more care involved. Otherwise it starts to feel like a disservice to the entire industry, because you are alienating audiences with these expensive, not worth it concerts. In any case, I have let you know my thoughts about this particular production of the show. Let me tell you about the performances. So we'll begin, of course, with Pixie Lott as Rita O'Grady, and she is primarily known as a singer. She has appeared on stage in a play before, and I thought her acting was decent here. If it was a little one note, she did that one note very well. She was stubborn, and she was righteous, and she was adamant. There is a requisite confidence and tenacity that you have to bring to this role, while also opening with an enormous amount of charm and warmth, and she did those two things. She didn't come across as too spiteful. You know, her heart was consistently in the right place, and she brought an awful lot of heart to it. She seems like she's a very lovely person. At least that's the sense that you get from the audience. The curious thing is when you have these singers who get cast in musical theatre, and it's not all of them, because Nicole Scherzinger, obviously hugely impressive with her vocals and her acting in Sunset Boulevard, but more often than not, there are singers that are put in musicals, and it's the singing that seems to be the biggest hurdle, which is really peculiar. And as I was listening to her vocal performance in this first act, perhaps she wasn't having the best vocal day, but she was making it sound like Rita O'Grady in MADE in Dagenham was a really vocally challenging role, and it's not particularly. Like, if she's making this seem this hard, should Gemma Arterton do Elphaba next? I'm sorry to say it, but it was a shortcoming of the evening. There was this husky quality to the vocals throughout, and by the time we got to that last song, I don't know whether she was singing it comfortably because she was deliberately easing off of the mic. She also, and not that the material gives her an awful lot of space to do this, but she didn't really grieve the death of her friend in the show. That and the separation from her children both felt like they needed to be larger emotional climaxes. She rises to anger very well. I just didn't think we got the sorrow and the really emotional low point. Alongside her, you had Killian Donnelly, and I have to say, I think I prefer him in these sorts of roles versus as the Phantom of the Opera. I really enjoy his voice in this kind of a style where it's a little bit more poppy. He sounded great. I thought his character was barely two-dimensional, but that's not his fault. He also was charming. He also hit the right comic moments that he needed to. But of this principal trio, Bonnie Langford was far and away the strongest. And I'm enjoying every opportunity that she is taking to remind audiences just how brilliant she is. She was astonishing in this. She is so old school, so showbiz, that when she is singing her number in the second act, meeting with all of the factory women while they are on strike, and she's singing about living in an ideal world, it was this Ethel Merman-esque vocal that I've not really known her for historically, but it was booming and it was grand and it was theatrical, and she was taking center stage and she was singing it with so much brashness. I wanted her to feel a little more on side with the women. She sort of felt more like a pawn of the government and of a misogynistic system. She didn't really feel like she wanted emotionally to help them, and I wanted her to be more outraged by the Prime Minister trying to like pinch her bum every time he walked past her. Like, you wanted more indignation from her. I don't know if that's a script thing or a Bonnie Langford thing, I couldn't tell you. But I loved her performance and I remain blown away by that second act vocal that she gave us. I think she could still do Gypsy, and should. Some regional theatre in the country has to let Bonnie Langford do Gypsy. I mean, come on now. Then we get to the extended supporting cast, and there are so many fantastic people to speak about. Jenna Boyd, we have to talk about as one of the factory workers, and she got these really extended moments of applause and laughter for these one-liner deliveries. She was so funny. She was playing this character who is argumentative and stubborn, and she is the one who makes sure that Rita finally delivers that speech at the end. And the best line, she came in from the side after their pictures had appeared in the paper and she was unhappy because she said she looked like a dinner lady. This got the longest laughter and applause. She's just wonderful, and she will always do a characterization like this very well. That is like perfect Jenna Boyd territory. I did enjoy Katie Seacombe as Connie. I wanted just a little bit more heart from her. I wanted to see more of the passion, and she was playing this very principled, very determined union representative within the female factory staff. And clearly, like, she had realised that there was no way for her to win in the system, so she'd become a little bit disenfranchised with all of it. But I wanted to see the flame reignited in her once they then started to demand equal pay, and I felt we never really got that moment of ignition. Another of my favourites, Zoe Rainey, who played Lisa Hopkins. I think this is a lovely part. I thought she did it very well, beautifully characterised, and all of her material with Pixie Lott as Rita, there was such a brilliant kinship between the two of them, and that's something that is hard to get right in the presumably short rehearsal time they had for this concert. That was one of, if not maybe the strongest relationship that I think that we saw on stage. Richard Dempsey, also very well characterised as her husband, Mr. Hopkins. I think he is brilliant. Trevor Dion Nicholas giving it brash American, and this villain, he got booed multiple times for just being nasty. He did a great job at that. And Gerard Carey, very scene-stealing, playing the Prime Minister, Harold Wilson. It was a really over-the-top comic caricature, which Gerard is great at, but definitely a scene-stealing performance. Speaking of which, the wonderful Oscar Conlon Murray, who, in as many terrible shows I have seen him in, has always been just about the best thing about them. And he is so multi-talented, he is so brilliant. Someone needs to write a show for this man. I keep saying it on here, but he played various roles in this show. He was a very sexist comic, which was sort of a transformative performance. It took me a second to realise that it was even him. He also plays the Cortina Man, and the flamboyance with which he did that was wonderful. And then scene stealing really is the word when he was playing one of the backing singers for Killian Donnelly's song to his wife, singing about how he loves her. Oscar had this moment where he's singing this repeated low harmony, singing "He's Always Yours." And just the facial expression that he was pairing with that, and then this moment at the end where he keeps singing after Killian asks them all to stop. So funny. Brilliant punchline. Oscar is one of those people who just knows how to make comedy out of almost nothing on stage. He is so naturally funny. It's just a gift. Now, something very special happened at this concert as well, because it was the professional debut of a young performer named Gerardine Sacdalan, and she is going to be seen later this year playing Juliet on the UK tour of the musical And Juliet. And let me tell you, she was playing Sandra in this. The voice that she has, so much power, so much range. I'm very excited to see her as Juliet now. She was sassy and feisty in this. Really lovely characterization, a really nice alternative to a lot of the other characters that we had on stage. A really confident debut performance from her. Like I said, I'm very excited to see her in the And Juliet tour. This was really strong. Peter Duncan played Monty, the factory worker who admitted that he had been holding a torch for Connie this entire time, despite undermining everything that she had been trying to achieve for herself and the other women. I don't know if this wanted to be played earlier on with a little more inner conflict about what he was doing, because his motivations are completely unclear, were completely unclear to me throughout this production, because he keeps turning on a dime and saying different things to different people, and you don't actually know until this final confession where he stands with it all. I don't think that was particularly well written. I think that presents an enormous challenge to anyone playing that role, but Peter Duncan didn't really bring a lot of clarity to it, unfortunately. Now I want to finish by saying a little bit about the future of this show, because I do think that it has a future life in it, and not just in community theatre, because this has been a really valuable show for amateur dramatic groups. It allows you to have a lot of people on stage, it allows you to utilise a lot of strong women, which amateur dramatic groups have, and like a Kinky Boots, it allows you to have ensembles filled with variety and filled with local people and everyone that is included within that. It's a really great show to allow you to cast in a way that is super inclusive, and you have these rousing numbers and it's energizing, and I'm sure it's really fun to perform while giving a few select individuals some moments to shine in the spotlight. But I do think that the shortcomings of the material notwithstanding, and it's no worse than a lot of the other screen-to-stage musical adaptations that we have going around right now, this ought to, at the very least, tour the UK. I don't know why this never got a UK tour after its first West End run. Whether the show's potential failure scuppered that, I don't know. But I do think if it was to return in a more substantial capacity now, that it would be more successful than it was 10 years ago. I think such are the tastes of audiences at the moment. Because it ticks a lot of the basic boxes. It's an inspiring, relatable British story. It's charming, it's funny, it has some blood-pumping tunes and relatable characters. I see no reason why in a different production, in a fuller production, where we see the cars, where we see the production line, where we see them at work, where we get the sense of them standing up from what they're doing and walking out, that this couldn't be really successful on tour. So I am hopeful for a future life for this show. But for now, those have been my thoughts about Made in Dagenham in concert at the London Palladium. Let me know what you thought about it down below, and thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you've enjoyed. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my theatre-themed YouTube channel for many more reviews and more theatre videos coming very soon. I hope that everyone is staying safe and that you have a stagey day. For 10 more seconds, I'm Mickey Joe Theatre. Oh my god, hey, thanks for watching, have a stagey day. Subscribe!